Welcome to The Book of Life, a show about Jewish books, music, film, and web. I'm Heidi Estrin. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida. Additional support comes from the Association of Jewish Libraries. Pieces of the Past, The Holocaust Diary of Rose Rabinowitz by Carol Matus, won the Canadian Jewish Book Award, and the Book of Life's Canadian correspondent in Toronto, Anne Dublin, interviewed Carol by Skype at her home in Winnipeg.
Winnipeg author Carol Matus is internationally acclaimed for over 40 books for children and young adults. Her best-selling work has been translated into many languages, including Spanish, Japanese, German, and French. She is well known for her Holocaust novels for teens, as well as science fiction, paranormal, and fantasy novels. Along the way, Carol has won many awards in Canada and abroad. They include the AJL's Sidney Taylor Award, the Jeffrey Bilson Award for Historical Fiction, the Ontario Library Association's Silver Birch Award, and the Canadian Jewish Book Award. In May 2014, Carol won the Helen and Stan Vine Canadian Jewish Book Award for her book, Pieces of the Past, The Holocaust Diary of Rose Rabinowitz. In late June, I interviewed Carol via Skype at her home in Winnipeg, Canada. Carol, welcome to the Book of Life podcast.
Hi, glad to be with you.
I'd like to start by asking you the question I ask every author. What were you like as a young reader? What kind of things did you like to read?
I was actually what they used to call a bookworm, and I read just about anything. In fact, my father had a kind of philosophy about reading, which was that any reading was good reading. So our house would be filled with Mad magazines, Archie and Veronica comics, and Dickens. There was no bad thing to read as far as my dad was concerned. And I carried that on with my children, interestingly enough. And my son, who didn't like to read when he was a kid at all, I just gave him a $5 allowance for comic books every week. And he would go and buy comics. And now he reads more than the rest of us put together. So I think it was a good philosophy of my dad's. And basically, I just loved to read from a very early age. First, my parents read to me, and those early books that they read to me were the Oz books by Frank Baum, which are still my favorite books. And then as I started to read by myself, I sort of graduated into the Nancy Drews, and, but at the same time as I was reading Nancy Drew, I was reading The Last Spike. To me, there wasn't, sort of high literature or low literature. It was all just the pleasure of reading.
Actually, I liked reading comic books too when I was a kid. Aside from all the other stuff, my brother and I would devour the Superman comics and Batman, and we loved it. So, what do you like best about writing for young people?
It's a funny thing. Writing for young people was not something that I decided to do. It almost chose me in a way. It was at that time I didn't know I was writing for young people is what I mean by that comment. I started to write, the first book that I wrote just happened to be about two characters who were young people. They were sort of around grade 5, sort of 10-year-olds, 10, 11-year-olds. And it was, at that time I was an actor, and other actors that I was hanging out with were writing. And I just, one of them wrote a story that kind of inspired me, and I thought, I wonder, if I could do that. And I went home and I wrote my first story, my first piece of fiction. And since I was a kid, that is, I used to write when we were in school, right? But I was already in my mid-20s by this time. It was a story about a magic teapot where the kids bump into the magic teapot and they shrink, and then they find themselves in a world of plants, because as I was sitting and writing, I was sitting beside my table that was full of plants and a teapot. So, I mean, I wrote that, and I read it to my friends, and they liked it, and that was about a 5-page story, and then I wrote another story, and it was maybe a 10-page story, and this went on for a few years, where I just kept writing longer and longer stories until I wrote my first full-length book when I was pregnant, and I couldn't act. And again, I didn't know I was writing for children. So when you say, what do you like best about it, it's almost like, well, I don't know anything else. I almost came up with the justifications of why I like it later. Because, so anything I say now would almost be like, well, now this is why I think I like it. But really, it was just, that's what I did. I just wrote those characters. And then the people that read them said, well, these are for young people, right? Because they're about young people. But I didn't really know at the time that that's what I was doing. I was just writing a story that happened to be about people of that age. And then later, when I started to send them out, people said, well, people of that age will want to read these stories, therefore you are writing for young people, right? And so then, as I learned more and more, as I sort of went on in the business of writing, I then sort of discovered what that meant in some ways, you know, and started to think about my audience more. Like, what do I want to say to them, and are there stories that I want to tell young people that they may not have heard before, which was always a big driver for me. I think that was and always and still is the main driver when I choose a story. It has this been said to them in this way before, or will this be something brand new that they've never encountered before, and will it maybe make them think about life a little bit differently and view things a little bit differently. So it always, you know, my books, I always have to feel like rather than, which always bugs my agents and everything, because they were like, well, if you just kept writing the same thing over and over, you'd be a lot richer. You know, because we could sell it, and you know, but I would always do the opposite. I would say, well, I've already written that. I want to write something completely different now. And they would be, well, that's not, you know, a good career move, because really a good career move is to sort of write the same thing over and over again, because then kids know what they can expect from you, right?
Yes, in one way. In another way, it's not so good to be predictable, I think.
Well, that's always what I thought too, and I always, my inspiration being Frank Baum, who was always surprising. You know, whenever I read him, I was surprised, and I always want that element of surprise in my books as well, so that when kids are reading it, they're not saying, well, this is the same old, right?
Right.
There's it's something that's surprising and different. Sorry, that's my dog you hear in the background.
That's fine. That's another surprising element. Well, actually, Carol, I mean, my question was a loaded one, because I personally think if a book that is well written, even though it's aimed for kids, will also appeal to adults. You know, I don't think as authors we want to limit ourselves.
I agree with that. And in fact, so in a sense I do what I've done from the beginning, which is I write about young people. You know, I write a story about young, you know, people of a certain age, right? And then the marketing people kind of take over. And they're the ones that decide who are going to read it. I mean, many of my books I've thought would be just as good for adults as for young people. Right. I remember when I wrote Sworn Enemies, I was like, well, why couldn't this be an adult book? And people were just like, well, because adults won't read a book this short. And I was
well,
I did. Well, why not? You know, like I would read a book that short. You know.
Listen, Carol, I read your books as an adult. I didn't have the luxury of reading them when I was a kid, so I loved reading them as an adult. So this sort of leads me to my next question. Since you want to tell stories maybe with a slightly different slant or a different approach, a lot of your books are about the Holocaust. I was mesmerized by Daniel's story, by Lisa, by After the War. I think I've read every one of your Holocaust books. So why? Why did you write about the Holocaust?
Yeah, that's kind of a long answer, I'm afraid. I was actually adverse to writing about the Holocaust in some ways, because when I first learned about the Holocaust, it colored my view of the world. And really, my view of the world was bleak. You know, I didn't believe, I had no spiritual life at all, because I didn't believe that a God could exist that would allow that to happen. And like most Jewish children, I learned about it at a young age. And I mean, I can't remember when, but I just remember that after learning about it, I wasn't interested in God or any kind of spiritual aspect of my life at all, because I was just like, well, that's it. It's, you know, and that was just the way things were. And plus, because I hadn't had any immediate relatives in the Holocaust, I didn't feel like it was my story to tell. Now, Lisa and Jesper were books that I wrote because they happened in Denmark, and they were personal stories in a way. Like, my husband's Danish, and, you know, I discovered that my father-in-law, which much of Jesper is based on, had been in the resistance. And they never talked about it, so I didn't know until many years after we were married that was the case. Somebody gave me a book about the rescue of the Danish Jews, and when I read it, I was like, wow, this is amazing. And it was very much about what I'd been writing about already in my science fiction books, which is one person can make a difference. And that's what all my science fiction books up to that point had been about. And I just thought, well, here you have a country that made a difference, you know? So I didn't even think, again, I wasn't thinking in terms of I am now going to write an historical, right? It's sort of the way all my writing has happened. It wasn't a marketing thing or a decision in terms of a genre. It was a story I wanted to tell about how that country made a difference, and I thought that was a really important story for young people. Because I thought if I didn't know that story, I'm Jewish, I went to Hebrew school, I'm well educated, you know, like, and I didn't know that an entire country saved just about their entire Jewish population. So if I didn't know that, I'll bet most Canadian kids didn't know it either. And so that was sort of the motivation to write that story. And of course, it had that very personal thing because of my father-in-law and my mother-in-law, and, you know, and my husband being Danish. And we went over there, and I was able to research it there. And so Daniel's story, I was asked to write by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum at Scholastic. And it was weird because I said yes before I even thought about it. I just said yes, and then they flew me out there, and they sort of outlined what they wanted from me, which was basically, they said, we're going to make an exhibit, and we want a book to complement it. It's not going to tell the story we're telling in the exhibit, but we want certain things to be the same. So Daniel has to be German. He has to have a family. He has to go to these 2 concentration camps, and he has to survive. And those were all my parameters. And the rest was up to me. So it was up to me where Daniel lived in Germany, but of course I had to go backwards, because if he was at Buchenwald at the end, you know, I had to figure out where he would have been at the beginning, right? Where those children came from, and, you know, and create his family and create this journey. And this sort of goes back to what I was talking about before, because about not believing in God and having no spiritual life, because during the writing of Daniel's story, I came to a completely different understanding of the world and the universe. And I actually gained a spiritual life through that book, which you would think would be the opposite. But it's a topic that I've ignored all my life, and by working through it, I was able to sort of come to the conclusion that Erica comes to in the book, which is, this is what it is. This is what we have, and we have choices. This is the way the world is made, and we have choices, and those choices can be for good or for ill. And sometimes our choices are very limited. As Erica says, we can die with love, or we can die with hate in our heart. We're going to die, but we can choose how to die. That might be our only choice. And so it was a kind of life-changing experience for me, personally, and I think it affected the rest of the, and then not only did it affect the rest of my life, because it sort of changed my whole view of life, but because I had written that, I kept discovering other stories. Like after I'd written Daniel's story, I started thinking, well, what would happen to Daniel? Now, Scholastic wasn't interested in a sequel, and that's how After the War came about. So I created a new character who, had experienced the Holocaust and then went to Israel or Palestine, right? And then after I'd written those, then as I would go touring or talking to people would come and tell me different stories, and things kept presenting themselves to me. Yeah. And even this last one, Pieces of the Past, I had actually put away all my Holocaust books and materials. I'd actually decided that was it, that I really couldn't write anymore because they're very difficult to write. Yes. And I put them all in storage when Scholastic called and said, we'd like you to write a Holocaust book for our Dear Canada series. Actually, I had gotten them out of storage before that because I had been writing an I Am Canada book for boys, and this was about the Flyers, the Canadian Flyers that ended up in Buchenwald, behind enemy lines. So I had already actually gone back to that world. And then it was just shortly after that they asked me to write Pieces of the Past.
That book really intrigues me. One, because it takes place in 1948 in Winnipeg, and that's actually the year when we came to Canada, when my family came to Canada in 1948 after the Second World War. Yeah, well, we came to Toronto, not Winnipeg, but it could have been. Probably just a small trick of fate. And so Rose Rabinowitz writes the diary. She's encouraged to write the diary by her, I guess, foster father, you would say. So one question I have for you, Carol, is about the first-person diary format. What are the pros and cons for you about writing like that in the first person?
In the first person or in the diary? Because there are two separate issues to me.
Okay, well let's talk about that, because I look at it as first person if it's diary, but probably not. So go ahead. There's two issues actually. I mean, most of my books are written in the first person. And when I started off with writing Lisa in the first person, that was a big, almost scandal at the time. Nobody was writing in the first person then. I could barely get an editor to edit the book. That was the first book I had with a big publisher, Lester and Orphan Dennis, and Louise couldn't find an editor to edit it because they were so nonplussed by this first person. Now, of course, it's extremely common, right? Right.
And actually, the reason that I did it then, it was an Israeli friend, a filmmaker, who suggested it to me. Because I said, I'm trying to write this book about Denmark and the Danish Jews, and there's so much information, and I can't get it all in. I just don't know how to manage the format. And he said, well, why don't you write it as if it's from, the first person point of view, and that will narrow it down, because then all you can describe is what's happening to you. To the character. That's right. And I said, okay, I'll try it. And it seemed to be a perfect format for historical fiction because it narrowed it down to the, to that kind of very sharp focus of action and speech and not a lot of, and it was perfect for me because with my background in the theater, I was able to write using just a lot of dialogue.
Right.
And not a lot of thinking, but using dialogue and action to express what my characters were thinking and feeling.
Right.
This was very difficult for people at the time, and editors wanted me to put in what they were thinking and what they were seeing and descriptions of the flowers and how the flowers smelled and how they felt and all of that kind of stuff. And I resisted and didn't do it, and it turned out to be a very successful book, but it was sort of very risky at the time. But, I've kind of stuck with that format. Now, the first book I wrote in diary format was for the Dear Canada, and that was Footsteps in the Snow.
Mm-hmm.
And really, the first-person diary format is very different than the first-person narrative, because a lot of diaries are written in the past tense with very little dialogue,
mm-hmm.
right? Or
Yes.
that's certainly the way that Scholastic prefers them to be written. So, I wrote my first diary almost the way I would write a regular book. Mm-hmm. And then my editor and I had this big, sort of fight about it. Like, well, you can't do that. Like, that's not how diaries are written. And I had to go and
mm-hmm.
research a bunch of diaries and say, well, some are, and, you can find people who write diaries like that, but that's not what they wanted. I actually feel that Footsteps in the Snow, in a way, is my least successful book because I didn't know how to handle the diary format correctly, and still have that energy going through it.
Yeah.
And so it was really a challenge. But by the time I wrote Turned Away, which was my first World War II kind of Holocaust book set in Winnipeg,
Yes.
about the Holocaust and about, this young girl living in Winnipeg who's trying to get her family over from France, and the sort of record of the Canadian government in turning away Jewish refugees.
Yes.
I somehow had gotten a handle on it, I felt, and I felt like that one was much more successful, and I was happy with it. And again, there were still some battles with my editor in terms of the style. But we seemed to be able to come to a more happy medium, where I think she finally accepted that, there was going to be more dialogue in it than she would be happy with, and I accepted that there was going to be a little less dialogue than I'm normally happy with.
Okay.
And we sort of came to an understanding with that.
Yeah. What I like about Pieces of the Past, one of the things I like, is that it switches between time and place, but in a very logical way. So it really helps that one is told in that diary form, and then the other sort of in the present. So I like that. It worked for me.
I got that idea because when I was researching after the war, I would ask people who had been through the war, the Holocaust, and had made it to Palestine, tell me about what happened after the war. And not one of those people could tell me what happened after the war until they had told me what happened during the war. It was so present for them. And this was another kind of argument that I had with my editor for Pieces of the Past, because she wanted more back and forth and more association. And I was very sort of clear that I wanted the past to be in the present tense. And I wanted that because that was what was so immediate to them. That was the life they were living in their minds. That was, in many ways, more real to them than even what was happening in the present.
That's right. And this is not a temporary thing. The trauma that they went through, I think, stay with survivors their whole life long.
Yeah. It's not something you can work through. It's not something you can have closure to. It's not something, and this is another thing that I think, a lot of people would like to see in Holocaust literature. My son said it so well at one point. I was talking about concerned maybe about writing a certain thing, and he just said, well, Mom, you can't make it pretty. It's never going to be pretty. It's never going to have closure. It's always going to be immediate. When I interviewed survivors, they would weep as if it happened yesterday. It wasn't that it happened 50 years ago.
No, to the very last day of their lives. But all we can do is tell the stories and hope that the reader, the young reader, will get it. And maybe it will make a difference in his or her life.
Well, you know, if you could tell 6 million stories, that would be the ideal. I think that every single person that died, they deserve to have their story told. Indeed. Unfortunately, we can't. You know, I mean, I wish we could. What I did and what I do try to do is take something like for this book, because I knew it was going to be read in the schools, right? And maybe it would be the only Holocaust book that a young child would read, because part of the Dear Canada series, and it might be the only Holocaust book that they'll encounter. I wanted to be sure that it was something that was representative. So it was one story, but I chose Poland because 3 million Jews died in Poland, right? It wasn't, and I chose Poland because there also was a resistance, and I wanted them to know that there was a resistance. You know, this fallacy of Jews just going like lambs to the slaughter wasn't true either. And so even though it's one person's story, I also tried to make it as broad as I could in this instance, so that if it's the only book they read, they'll get a real sense of what happened.
And Carol, it worked. It was successful. I mean, there were parts in that book that brought me to tears, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
I was crying. I had to stop reading for a while because it really got to me personally and emotionally. Well, that's what we try to do as writers. So I just have a couple more questions for you. Would you like to tell us about what you're working on now, or what will be published shortly? Anything that you want to share?
Yeah, I have thank you for asking, first of all. I have a new book that's going to launch October the 1st, but it'll be available sooner than that, probably by sort of August, September.
Thank
you. It's with a non-traditional publisher, which means that it will not be in the bookstores outside of McNally Robinson here in Winnipeg. It will be print on demand and ebook. It's called Tucson Joe, and it's actually a book that's about 8 years in the making. I started writing it a long, long time ago, and I've been going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth with it. It just really came together over the last year. And it's based on the first Jewish mayor of Tucson in 1882. In 1882 in Tucson, that fellow called Charles Strauss moved his family to Tucson and became mayor.
So is it an historical, or is it a biography?
Yes, it's an historical. Yeah,
okay.
It's an historical fiction. But it's sort of, maybe I shouldn't say based on, but inspired by. Yeah, and I saw an exhibit called Jews in the Wild West when I was in California. And there was this picture of this little Jewish guy with his son, and they were all dressed up like cowboys. Yeah. And I was like, really? You know, with guns and, you know, big rifle, and the rifle was bigger than he was, you know. And I was like, that's so cool. But then I discovered that, you know, he really actually was dressed up like that. He took a photo like that with him and his son to send to his friends back east. But really, he wasn't a cowboy at all. Anyway, it's really a father-daughter story, and it's a story about a young woman and her independence and feminism, and it's about law and order and all kinds of things like that.
Sounds like fun.
It is. It's fun, and it's got some, you know, some questions for kids and some things for them to think about, you know, like my books always do.
Tucson Joe? That's the name of it?
Tucson Joe, yeah.
Okay.
And it's spelled J-O because her name is Josephine.
Oh, well, I'm glad you cleared that up.
She's independent and, you know, an independent young woman of the Wild West, right? And her father is, you know, not so keen on that. So, It's this kind of battle that goes on throughout the book.
Sounds
really good. It's been a lot of fun to work on. I've really enjoyed it.
It'll be a nice change from Holocaust, too.
Yeah, and then I'm going right from that into a science fiction book that I'm writing for Scholastic. So that'll be a really, great change as well.
Great. You certainly are a prolific author. I really admire you.
I used to be. I mean, I've certainly slowed down since my 3 grandchildren have arrived in the world. I have other duties other than writing.
Well,
like today, taking care of, the little sick one, and things like that. So, I'm not as prolific as I used to be, but I feel like these are times you don't want to miss. Pretty soon, they'll be too old for me, and, they'll be hanging out with their friends. So I want to spend time with them when they still want to spend time with me.
Right, and you'll keep writing. God willing. So, Carol, we're going to wind it down now, I think. Thanks so much for telling us about your writing life. So, for more information about Carol Matus and her many books, you can go to her website at www.carolmatus.com. This is Anne Dublin signing off in Toronto.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast, follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod, email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com, or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida, at cbiboca.org, and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.